The following set of tutorials is going to describe the more obscure mechanics in Bloodborne, such as the blood gems, Caryll Runes, and the ever so infamous Chalice dungeons. This video isn't necessarily meant for fresh players, and I mean fresh out of the oven players. If you don't understand the basics of Bloodborne, as in its combat, how to level up, or even the UI, I'll encourage you to check out the beginner's guide video from VaatiVidya, who I think does a succinct job at giving players a good enough foundation to pick up a controller and play a game like Bloodborne for the first time. Otherwise, if you think you're someone who has a bit of a grip on Bloodborne, or you're a bit of a nerd, then buckle up. We're going for a ride. So let's say, hypothetically speaking, you already have your weapon of choice. Could be the saw cleaver, hunter axe, threaded cane, etc. You know how to swing them, you know how to move, you know how to look cool. Or you're at least halfway there. The question now is, how do you get these things to do more damage? Well, you need three things: upgrades, stats, and blood gems. Upgrades are simple enough to understand. You will find upgrade materials such as bloodstone shards that raise your weapon's damage, aka AR, the more of the shards you find. The order of upgrades goes as such. Bloodstone shards bring your weapon from +0 to +3. Twin bloodstone shards bring your weapon up to +6. Bloodstone chunks bring it to +9, and finally, blood rocks cap out your weapon at +10. All along the way, not only does each upgrade raise your weapon's base damage, but also its stat scalings, down here. This brings us to the stats of your character. In order to make an overly long topic short enough, the higher the grade a weapon has for a stat, the more you want to level up that said stat. Make sense? For example, let's say that you want to use the threaded cane. The threaded cane starts off with an E in strength and a C in skill. Don't worry about that letter in arcane, we'll save that for later. These letters dictate how much damage your weapon will receive the higher your respective stat becomes. So in the cane's case, you want to prioritize learning skill much more than strength, because the returns from skill will give you far better damage output. Vice versa, the hunter axe gives strength a higher grade. So if you want to do more damage with the axe, pump strength first. There will be weapons that want both strength and skill, or want other stats like blood tinge or arcane, but the same concept applies to those weapons as well. Also, I should reiterate that upgrading these weapons through the bloodstone shards will raise the letter grades and thus the stats scaling. The C in skill for the threaded cane will rise until the weapon reaches +10 and stops at a grade A. In summary, keep upgrading your weapons and be mindful to raise the right stats of your character too. And let's quickly bring up that arcane letter from the threaded cane. You will find that many weapons will have a hidden arcane scaling that doesn't actually affect the physical damage of the weapon. The saw cleaver and hunter axe are clear comparisons. Rest assured, this hidden arcane stat won't come into play unless you equip certain blood gems on your weapons that convert the weapon's physical damage into fire, bolt, or arcane. Speaking of, let's now talk about the final ingredient to making your weapon do damage, and arguably the most important ingredient: blood gems. You'll notice that each weapon has 3 gem slots. You'll also notice that these slots start off grayed out on an unupgraded weapon and become opened once you do upgrade them. Let's note that you can unlock every weapon's gem slots at the same upgrade levels. The first gem slot of a weapon will open when you upgrade it to +1. The second opens at +3, and the third at +6. The blood gems I mentioned will fit right into these. And what are blood gems? Blood gems are special items that you equip onto your weapons that give them an added effect. The effects can vary. Some gems might regenerate your health. Some gems might poison your enemies. Some gems will even convert a weapon from doing physical damage to doing fire, bolt, or arcane damage, as I mentioned earlier. But like I said, The most important gems, especially for newer players, will be the ones that take your weapon's AR, or attack rating, and amplify it. If you see gems called tempering blood gems, these are the ones you ought to get the most acquainted with. Tempering blood gems will increase your weapon's physical attack as their primary effect. It's also worth noting that the name scheme of blood gems will also coincide with the effect you will see on the gem itself. Now, we're not going to try and list all the different gems and their names in this video, but rest assured the names start making much more sense the more gems you pick up and get familiar with. Looking closer at a gem itself, we can also make note of a gem's rating. The higher the rating, the more powerful it will be and the more effects it might have. The lowest rating is 1 and the highest is 20. While we're here, let's briefly talk about the different layers of effects a gem might have: primary, secondary, and curses. The first gems in the game that you will pick up are going to be incredibly basic. They will only have one effect tied to them, and this is their primary effect. Over time, as you progress further into the game, you'll see 2 or 3 different effects on a gem at once. Secondary effects, or the effects right below the primary, won't start making too much of a difference to you until you start picking up the rarest of gems. I would recommend that you pay attention to what secondary effects will give you extra damage or beneficial gimmick than anything else. Something like a flat physical attack increase would be good for most. And lastly, there are curse effects. You won't see any of these until you're late in the game or in the Chalices, but it goes without saying, in order to have a particularly powerful gem in this game, there comes a cost. The different kinds of curses a gem might have will range from barely noticeable, even non-intrusive, like kin attack down or stamina use increased, to completely ruining and unusable, like HP drain or all attack down. In order of importance, getting a gem with a great primary effect should be your main concern. Curses come second because they will completely trash a gem if you aren't careful, and if the RNG is particularly unseemly. Once you have a proper, primary, and suitable curse, you'll be right as rain. Only the biggest of nerds really squirm over getting the right secondary effect, so try not to worry all that much about it unless you have way too much time on your hands and want to farm the absolute best gems. I mean, people have done less for longer amounts of time. Moving on from the effects, we need to talk about gem shapes. There are 5 different gem shapes in the game: radial, triangle, waning, circle, and droplet. The first 4 shapes can only fit into a slot that match them. A radial gem can only go into a radial slot. A waning gem can only go into a waning slot, and so on. Droplet gems are unique, however. These gems only drop from the winter lanterns that you find later in the game. You know the ones, they're incredibly hard to miss and incredibly hard to forget. Droplets are like the jack of all trades in Bloodborne. The droplets can fit into whatever slot they please, shape be damned. However, they won't ever be the best in any of the 4 slots. They can, however, fill a temporary role in one of your weapons while you wait for a better gem to come moseying along. And that will wrap up blood gems, at least for now. Caryll Runes. If you're familiar with other Souls games, these runes are like equipping rings, except not as convenient nor instantaneous. If you're unfamiliar with other Souls games, these runes are special items that you equip on your hunter while at the workshop in the Hunter's Dream. Before you can even equip any runes, however, you first need to find the Rune Workshop tool, which is found after you beat the Witch of Hemwick. Conveniently enough, she will be at the similarly named area, Hemwick Charnel Lane. Go figure. What's special about these runes is that they give your hunter special effects, like giving them more health, more stamina, or higher defenses. There are also runes that can give you more blood echoes from killing enemies so you can level up faster. Furthermore, there are runes that can give you better RNG drop rates so you can farm for certain items, upgrade materials, or unique blood gems. Slightly moving on, each rune also has at least 3 different versions of itself. For example, the clockwise metamorphosis runes, or the runes that give you more HP, are 3 of a kind. The first version gives you 5% more health, the second gives you 10%, and the third gives you 15%. The different runes and their variations are scattered around the main game and even in the Chalice dungeons themselves. Now, we've only accounted for the first 3 rune slots. The 4th and final rune slot is reserved for oath runes. These oath runes are each unique, not just in the written effect that they tell you when they equip them, but also because some of them have a hidden mechanic about them. Most of them, in fact, put your character into an in-game faction. The Corruption rune makes your Hunter a Vile Blood. Radiance makes you an Executioner. Hunter makes you a Hunter of Hunters. And Impurity makes you a Confederate. Which is really odd to say out of context. Anyway, there are 2 other DLC runes, Beast Embrace and Milkweed. They have pretty neat effects in their own right, but they don't put your character into a faction like the first 4 do. Excluding the Impurity rune, these 3 oath runes put you into a PvP faction. Now let me explain. If a host player rings the beckoning bell to summon a cooperator, and that cooperator has an opposing oath rune, they will be summoned as an enemy purple rather than a friendly blue. Now let's get specific. If the host, say, has Corruption and the cooperator has Radiance, they will be enemies and can kill each other. Vice versa, if the host has Radiance and the cooperator has Corruption, the same thing will happen. In the lore of Bloodborne, Vile Bloods and Executioners are nemeses. As for the Hunter of Hunters, if the host player rings the beckoning bell, but this said host has invaded other players through the use of the Sinister Bell, they might end up becoming blood-addled. Instead of this host receiving a friendly blue, a Hunter of Hunters will come in as, you guessed it, an enemy purple. Because in the lore, Hunter of Hunters go after the blood-addled. Because red man bad. These are the PvP factions. Side note, purples can fight and engage with invader reds. Purples cannot fight other purples, nor can reds fight with other reds. But both a purple and a red can fight the host and their blues together. Happy hunting. Moving on, there's Impurity. This is the co-op rune. Confederates are friends with everyone, which is also odd to say out of context. So again, the main perk to having the Impurity rune equipped is that you will get a consumable reward whenever you help a host defeat a boss, and it's called Vermin. Crushing these vermin is mainly used for raising one's rank in the Confederate scoreboard and for continuing a certain NPC's questline. I'm not going to get into said questline here. Speaking of scoreboards though, Vile Bloods get a similar reward when they kill either NPC hunters or player hunters. They get blood dregs. These blood dregs can be consumed to give them additional insight, which is useful for buying more items from the messengers in the hunter's dream, or the dregs can be given to their Vile Blood Queen to raise their ranks within the Vile Blood Register, which is another scoreboard. However, both scoreboards might be topped by either hackers or lifers, so try not to get too bent out of shape because someone has a higher number than you. And that's basically it for Oath Runes, most of them at least. Get it? Got it? Good. Now, your choice of Oath Rune won't particularly matter all of the time unless someone's doing a certain broadcasted event with Oath Runes. Oh wow, I wonder who could possibly be doing something like that. So choose your oath at your own discretion or have no oath on at all. Meanwhile, the 3 normal rune slots are going to be the ones that you ought to put a lot more consideration into. The best recommendation from the community to newer players is to prioritize getting the Clockwise Metamorphosis 3 and 2, as well as the Anti-Clockwise Metamorphosis 3. From these runes, you get 15% and 10% more health, while also getting 20% more stamina. If you're using a weapon that doesn't use a large amount of stamina, or you think you've gotten more adept at the game's combat, consider changing the anti-clockwise rune for a Great Lake rune instead. This Great Lake will give you higher defense absorption from all types of damage, making you slightly tougher to kill and possibly saving you from a fatal blow in the future. There are going to be situations where you might want different runes for certain tasks, but this trio ought to be the default for most. Unless you're a nerd who knows better, in which case there's a locker over there, get in. Also, before I finish this segment, almost all of the best runes in the game are going to be found in the Chalice dungeons. What's more is that all of the best blood gems in the game are also going to be found in the Chalice dungeons as well. Now, we've danced around these cursed things for long enough. Let's jump into them already. Chalice dungeons are a huge, crucial part of Bloodborne, while also being completely optional and skippable. Sounds like contradictory information, and it is, but stick with me here. You very well could reach the credits and not have to touch one bit of them. And if that's how far y'all want to take the game of Bloodborne, then watch no further. This video is done for you. But there are plenty of reasons why someone ought to be interested in diving a bit deeper into the game and understanding these chalices. For those who want to 100% Bloodborne and get the Platinum Trophy, you will need to fight the Chalice's bosses and obtain hidden weapons and armor sets all along the way. If you're interested in Bloodborne's lore, the Chalices have more of that. If you're interested in randomly generated exploration, the Chalices have that. If you want to fight in a 5-player brawl that's pure, chaotic bliss, the Chalices have that. If any of the above has intrigued you, then I implore you keep watching. I might not delve into every single detail, but I at least want to equip you with the absolute basics of how these infernal things work. First, I'm going to start with a simple roadmap, up to and through your first Chalice dungeon. Then we'll see if you're still on pace with me. I hope I don't lose y'all along the way. Ready? Okay. First, start the game.
Whatever happens, you may think it all a mere bad dream.
Then go fight and beat Father Gascoigne. Afterwards, open the Odin Chapel gate and make your way into the Cathedral Ward. Once there, make your way through a levered passageway into Old Yharnam. Keep going deeper into this area until you find 2 pieces of Ritual Blood 1 in this dark, dank church chamber. You'll find them on a well-lit altar, so they're incredibly hard to miss. Go further into the level and beat the area's boss, the Bloodstarved Beast. Once you do, you'll get the Thumaru Chalice. Now head back to the Hunter's Dream, and here's where we can slow down a bit. If you go to the longer cobblestone incline in the dream, you'll find a makeshift altar and 6 other tombstones. We'll talk about the makeshift altar later. For now though, the 6 other tombstones will give you 3 options if you approach them. Perform a Chalice ritual, Chalice dungeon search, and search by Chalice glyph. By performing a Chalice ritual, you will then be able to teleport into said Chalice dungeon and explore the layers within. Seeing how you have the Thumaru Chalice in your possession, you can perform the Chalice ritual to open it. Now before we do, let's look at the ritual requirement screen. Each new Chalice you get will want specific Chalice materials and a certain amount of blood echoes before you can perform that ritual and go into them. This first Chalice you get is practically a freebie, but the later, deeper Chalices will want rarer materials and even more echoes. You can also find a few ritual materials from the base game as well. If you were wondering what all that red jelly and yellow backbone was needed for, it was for these Chalices. Now let's talk about the 2 other options in the Tombstone menu. You can only use these 2 options if you're online and have PlayStation Plus. So let's just assume for the next couple of minutes that you're going through the Chalices in the offline vanilla way. In which case, there's going to be a handy-dandy visual guide that will cover your every step from the very first Chalice to the very last. The link to said guide will be in the description. It's one big scrolling paper, super simple to follow. You won't go wrong with it, I promise you. For now though, we're moving on. We will come back to this menu though. If we look back at the ritual requirements screen, we'll notice that each chalice has a specific depth number attached to it. The bigger the number, the deeper the depth. The deeper the depth, the more difficult the chalice and its bosses become. The depths range from 1 to 5, the easiest being 1. Once you hit depth 3, there's a noticeable difficulty spike. Depth 4s only grow higher in difficulty, with the 5s being the most challenging dungeons, yet yielding the best rewards and loot. Depth 5s are where you get the best blood gems and runes from, by the way, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, let's quickly talk about the inside of the chalices and what the layouts of them actually are. What do they look like? Fortunately for you, we have a visual aid for that too. As you can see by this picture, chalices have a rather simplistic foundation. Their interior designs will vary, but the foundations will not. What is certain is that nearly every chalice after the first Thumaru chalice you get will follow this structure. There is a lamp, a gate, and a boss, first and foremost. Then there's a pre-lamp side path, a huge sprawling main area where you have to go find a lever to open the said gate, and then an additional pre-boss side path before you go and fight the Layers boss. Now, you can skip the side paths and just head to the lever and the gate to fight the boss, but it is in the side paths and in the sprawling main area where you find various loot such as ritual materials, upgrade materials, new weapons, new armor sets, or even new blood gems. And that's all before you fight the boss. The bosses themselves can drop new chalices for you to create, or even drop you the best blood gems in the game. Once you beat the said boss though, you then descend one layer further into the chalice and the layout repeats until you run out of layers. If you understand this map, then nearly all of the chalice interiors will start to make much more sense. They'll attempt to confuse you with various new hallways, roundabouts, and hidden shortcuts, but this map still remains relevant through it all. Another thing to note, nearly all chalices will have at least 3 layers in total for you to get through. A few might have 4 layers, but that's the maximum. But now, let's pause a bit. Say you beat the second layer of your first Thumaru chalice. You get a Thumaru root chalice as a reward from that second boss. Now the question is, how does this root chalice differ from the normal chalice that you already have? It goes something like this. If a chalice has root in its name, it means that when you make this chalice, that the layout will never be the same. Root chalices give you the randomly generated dungeons of this game. If a chalice doesn't have root in the name, then they are fixed, meaning that the layouts, layers, and bosses will be the same no matter how many times you make it or which player makes it. This is how players are able to co-op through the fixed chalice dungeons rather easily. Players can make the same chalice and progress through them at the same time. Now the question becomes, if the root chalices are always different, how do players manage to co-op and invade each other in them? And this is where the glyph codes and the makeshift altar come in. Say that you and a friend want to go through a randomly generated root chalice. Only one of you has to make one through the chalice ritual option. Then the other player can join in by typing in the glyph code that spawns when a chalice ritual is made. Now mind you, both of you do have to have the same root chalice though. Be sure of that. But before you go typing in glyph codes, the maker of the root chalice has to share their glyph first. Chalice makers have 2 options when sharing their glyph. They can either make it closed or open. Closed means that only players who know the glyph code can enter into the chalice for co-op or invasions. This option right here. Open means that not only can anyone enter through the use of the glyph code here, they can go all the way over to the makeshift altar and use its quick search feature for either cooperation or invasions. Side note, you can only access the makeshift altar through the use of a short ritual root chalice. And you can only buy this from the upper bath messengers in the Hunter's Dream, right after you beat the third boss in the first chalice you got from the Bloodstarved Beast. That's right, the first Thumaru Chalice you got. So that set of sentences was a bit of a mouthful, so let me just repeat it again, but slower. Play all the way through the first chalice you get after beating the first Bloodstar beast. Once you beat the third boss, which is this big fire doggo, go up to the side of the workshop and you can buy the short root chalice. Take this back to the makeshift altar and quick search away for no material cost at all. It does cost you 10 insight to buy, which you ought to have after coming out of the chalice at this point, and is well worth the purchase. However, going ahead, I do need to tell you about this. Quick searching from the makeshift altar has a few caveats. Not everyone opens their root chalices these days, so activity might be slow or deadlocked even. What might make activity even slower than that is the fact that when you do connect to somebody, the game has to generate the chalice on that altar and then connect you into the world before you can even join. This process might take a few minutes or so if you're trying to get into a specific player's world. And in that case, I would recommend that if you want to join a specific player, consider going to one of the 6 tombstones and use the glyph search option instead. By doing this, you put in the glyph code that you know, go into said dungeon, go to the layer that they are currently on, and ring either your blue bell or your red bell in person. The short route search is still a rather convenient tool in some cases, but don't expect it to work all of the time. This is Bloodborne matchmaking we're talking about after all. All this leaves is the second option, back at the tombstone menu, which is the Chalice Dungeon Search. This option allows you to randomly generate any player-created dungeon under certain parameters of your choosing. This is of course accounting for the fact that you yourself have made a chalice similar to what you're looking for. So you can't just go looking for something like a Depth 5 chalice right off the bat when you only have made a Depth 1 chalice in the past. Also, you have to consider that you're trying to find chalices that were made open and not closed. This option should be used for those people who are just looking for variety in their life. It's a rather neat idea and it doesn't cost you any materials to make. Moving on, let's now talk about the 4 types of chalices that there are in the game. And when I talk about types, I mean the Thumaru, Loran, Is, and Hintertomb type chalices. The Thumaru chalice you have is a part of a set of chalices known as the Thumaru. Get it? As you progress further in the base game, you'll find other later bosses that will drop you a Loran or an Is chalice. You do get a Hintertomb while you're rummaging around in the other chalices, but I'll just say now that the Hintertomb isn't particularly worthy of note, nor is it all that important for the purposes of this video. It does have loot that the other chalices don't have, such as a unique armor set and unique enemies to fight, but otherwise, they're not too exciting. The main takeaway you should get from knowing the 4 types of chalices is that each chalice has their own unique dungeon design, their own unique enemies, and most importantly, unique blood gem drops. Thumaru will give you radial blood gems to fit in the radial slots of your weapon. The Loran will give you waning gems, and the Is will give you triangles.
And the Hintertomb is also here.
Furthermore, it's important to note that the different types of chalices will add their own effects onto the gems you farm. Thumaru will primarily give you physical damage gems, such as tempering or adept. Loran will give you fire, bolt, and poison blood gems along with physical gems. And lastly, Is chalices will start to add arcane to the potential drops you might receive. And believe me, it gets more complicated from here if we wanted to talk about all the blood gem drop tables and the socio-economic implications of rising gem inflation, but for now, I'll save you the overwhelming insight gained to move on to another topic instead, but one that is all the more relevant. Speaking of, you'll be happy to hear that we're on the home stretch of this entire video. Take some extra sips of water, stretch yourself out a bit, because all we need to talk about now are the final variations of chalices that you ever need to worry about in Bloodborne. The Cursed Chalices and the Sinister Chalices. Cursed Chalices. Some call them FRC or CRF Chalices, but the cool kids call them FRC. This is because they have certain rights. or modifiers that get added to the chalices that you create. The FRC stands for these rights. The F stands for fetid, R for rotted, and C for cursed. The fetid right strengthens certain enemies, giving them a visible red aura. The rotted right lets new enemies appear, ones that you may have never seen before in the entire game. What are they exactly? Oh, wouldn't you like to know? Oh, I don't know either. Lastly, the cursed right cuts your health down by half. Think Halo Legendary, all skulls on. Yeah, that good stuff right there. It's in these chalices where you obtain the best of the best blood gems. All of the glyph codes that you see on all the spreadsheets floating around all of the internet are transfixed around these cursed chalices. They may sound intimidating at first, but with a little knowledge and a decent amount of courage, you too can reap good loot, if the RNG is in your favor, of course. Last but most certainly not least, there's the Sinister Chalices. Similar to the Cursed Chalices, the Sinister Chalices have a right modifier of their own. If you activate the Sinister right on these chalices, they will spawn a bell-ringing woman on all of their layers instantly as you come into the world. What's more, if you ring your Sinister Bell while inside of the Sinister Chalice, another bell-ringing woman will spawn right alongside the first. And what does having 2 bell-ringing women mean in Bloodborne? 2 invaders. You can be invaded by 2 reds. And what's more, you can summon 2 enemy purples through the Oath Runes that we mentioned earlier. Now you have a full-blown 2v2v1, a 5-player bash. And y'all, this is pure, chaotic, blood-drunk fun. Definitely what Miyazaki intended. I encourage y'all to try something like this in the future. Anyway, that's about it for Chalice Dungeons. We did it, we got through it all. Psych, that's not really it for the Chalice Dungeons. It's been years since the game originally came out, and you might be surprised to hear this, but the Chalice Dungeons have actually been updated since then. Which is a bit of a half-truth for me to say, because From Software hasn't updated the Chalice Dungeon for years. No, the community has updated the Chalice Dungeons through their own sheer force of will. And how have they done that? Through the use of save-edited dungeons. Now, usually when you hear the words multiplayer and save editor in the same sentence, the first thought is cheating. Players typically edit their characters to be made impossible to kill, or they one-shot you without a second thought. You know, cheaters who cheat maliciously and selfishly, completely ruining the fun of the game through the use of save editors. But Bloodborne is a unique case. In Bloodborne, players have instead come together to edit the part of the game that needed the most attention, the chalices. What these players have done is take the rather bloated flowchart of about a dozen chalices that you have to go through, 20-something bosses that you have to kill, right? They took this and they made it so much shorter through something called the false step chalices, which I have made a video on before. You can view that now too. In today's Bloodborne, you can now make a character and get to the best blood gems and runes in the game in half of a typical play session. 3 hours or less. That is if you know what you're doing in those chalice dungeons, of course. They've also tweaked blood gem drop rates so that the farming is slightly less abysmal and more in your favor than it has ever been. They've also made finding loot like runes, uncanny and lost weapon variants, and the very so coveted blood rocks immensely simple. And that's just it. The main reason why folks would want something like this is because in the past you had to go through hours of just restarting the chalices just to get all the way to the end. But if you're going to play Bloodborne online in the current year and you have PlayStation Plus, you have to take advantage of these dungeons. The link to the extensive Bloodsheets and their glyph codes will be in the description, and there will be another link that will detail how you can shortcut yourself from the start of the chalices all the way to the cursed chalices in no time at all. Because a lot of people left Bloodborne due to the grind needed to just play a character. Times have changed, let it be known. And I would love to talk more about it, but unfortunately for y'all, that's about it for me. Thank y'all for watching this all the way through. I hope you learned a thing or two. Here's to the PS5 and Bloodborne being made free for all PlayStation Plus owners when it comes out. You could have very well stumbled upon this video because of this very feature. And for Souls veterans, y'all know what this means, right? Meat's back on the menu. Anyways, I got a jam for now, but y'all take care of yourselves and please stay safe. I'll see y'all whenever I see y'all next. For now, peace.